Yeah, all right.
All right, so I guess everybody welcome. Welcome back after a few weeks after we had Robert Lenz as our first webinar, and then this is now with Rustam Hasanov. He's been with us already twice, and he's going to come back this summer, hopefully, if everything allows. So we're going to spend an hour with him, and just allow me to very quickly introduce or answer some of the questions through a presentation, what ANOMALIA is. So I had a few questions about what we do at ANOMALIA, and this is where we met also Rustam. And so very quickly, here's the way to introduce it. First with a video.
ANOMALIA connects accomplished Hollywood veterans with young creatives from Central Europe to exploit the all-time high demand for animation content. The goal? To lay the foundations for quality, expertly crafted, audience-driven feature films and series. ANOMALIA Story and Art Labs is an animation incubator that provides artists with the ideal platform to achieve box office and global distribution success. In 2020, despite the worldwide pandemic, we managed to host our 5th edition of the Intensive Professional Incubator in the heart of picturesque Czech Republic. Individual teams worked on a total of 5 films and 6 series, each with a unique vision. Directors and screenwriters had the opportunity to consult their stories with experienced Hollywood mentors Robert Lenz and Shelley Hoffman. For feature films, they discovered how to identify key narrative moments or story beats. For series, they learned how to develop different episodic treatments. Under the guidance of experienced directors, including Emmy Award-winning art director Rustam Hasanov, these story beats were broken down further into character and environment design. These concepts were then used to create the final story images before applying the finishing touches at our digital painting workshop. Here, under the tutelage of art director Tomáš Toušek, participants were shown how to grab an audience's attention using color, light, and atmosphere. At ANOMALIA, we connect the future with now. We plan to expand the incubator to include a real-time production pipeline, representing a new paradigm for animation film development and production. This will involve teams working on look development to create animated samples and teasers for their films and series. In another exciting development, we'll be working with Unreal Engine, the state-of-the-art 3D platform that's revolutionizing the animation industry. ANOMALIA, boost your project.
So very quickly, I'll just explain basically, I guess, what was already visible in the video is that the incubator, what we're trying to do is to focus on the story and combine it together with art labs. And that's essentially what Rustam is going to be talking about, is that what we're trying to simulate is a working environment where we learn, but at the same time, we're working on specific projects that producers or anybody who has a project and a team brings it to the labs. And so what we plan to do this summer is to have a story lab for features and story lab for series running in parallel for 2 weeks, and then whatever is figured out during that time is brought over to the art labs, which is art direction. That's going to be where Rustam is heading to, and character design. And then these teams that's still working together on providing the art directors and directors with their visual ideas, and then the digital painting lab. And basically the essential goal is to provide the teams with an environment for intensive work. We try to get Hollywood professionals as their mentors, not so much about them being from Hollywood, but them being experienced with working on big projects and in a collaborative environment. And also what's useful is that we try to put into the teams also art interns, so that's additional hands that are helping out with the craft, and board of experts. So once the labs are over, we send out, we have a selection of international experts from producers, sales agents, and distributors who give feedback to these projects. So that's an additional way how to help people to continue so that they don't give up necessarily or stall for too much after the labs are finished. It's what's essential for us is the environment. So what we choose is a castle environment. It's a UNESCO heritage site. And that stimulates the creativity, which at the end should end up with these packages that in terms of the story, people develop loglines, synopsis, they define the characters, and then this year we will hope to focus on developing storyboards for teasers. So there's also that direction and a specific detail that's explored. We haven't done that before, so we're looking forward to this. And then people end up with character design, environments, film posters, and altogether our hope is that these projects and the teams that work on the project end up with a package that essentially represents the project to the world around. And just final slide is people were asking about the registration deadline and when it's going to be last 2 weeks in September, and then first 2 weeks in September and last 2 weeks in August. So last 2 weeks in August, first 2 weeks in September. That's when we are running the next labs. And that's it. That's it from me. So Rustam, now it's your turn. And then we're looking forward to having
Can you hear me all right?
Yes, I do. And then if I do, hopefully it's everybody else. And also one more thing I want to say that Rustam's computer didn't work out for this session just a few minutes before we started. So the PDF is on my end, and then I'm going to share it.
You're going to be my slide helper.
Okay. Okay. And one more thing, I guess I have to go with slideshow form. All right.
All right. Looks like it's working pretty good. All right. Hey, everybody. So I'm Rustam Hasanov. I don't know, most of you probably don't really know that much about me. I am a visual development artist mostly, and I also do art direction for medium to small to big projects in Los Angeles. I've art directed some of my key projects, I guess I would say, would be art direction on Troll Hunters, the TV show on Netflix, made by Guillermo Del Toro. I'm kind of known for having done the concept for the intro to Game of Thrones. That was really fun over a period of like 10 years. I've done some other things, so look me up. But basically, I've mostly worked in animation. And this particular presentation that I'm doing for you today on world building is a presentation I've done a few times before, but not really in this format where I basically have just under an hour to go over these basic principles. So I'm going to do the best I can to go through it as quickly as possible and make it as simple and cohesive enough for everybody to kind of understand what I'm talking about, because world building is a very broad concept. It doesn't necessarily just apply to artists and designers. It also applies to writers and really on every stage of development. Of course, I'm trying to lean more on the visual aspects of world building. So we'll just, as quickly as possible, go through and give you a little introduction to that. So first stage is basic principles. Just these are sort of like the things that you need to kind of be aware of. You might have heard these before, but just as a refresher, we're just going to go through them. And I also have some examples to make it as clear as possible what that means. So next slide. So first of all, just to jump right in, you are not God. So you have to simplify and curate the world that you're creating. And basically what I mean by that is there's absolutely no way that you can create every little thing in a world. People have tried and people will continue to try. But in terms of making a completely original world, it's pretty much impossible because for one thing, everything is based on our bias of things that already exist. And second of all, that world is already way too complex for us to try to replicate. So this is why I called this presentation World Building for Narrative, because the narrative is going to guide how large and expansive this world is going to be. And one example on the next slide, next slide. So one example, nope, the one before. So the example I like to use for this is one of my favorite movies, The Adventures of Baron Munchausen by Terry Gilliam. And there was a set that was supposed to be very, very elaborate of a lunar city. And they basically ran out of budget very quickly. So what they did instead was to take the production designer Dante Ferretti's drawings for the stage that they were going to build. And they essentially turned them into boards, and these cut out boards, and they sort of stacked them on top of each other, and they just kind of used a very creative cinematic way of shooting it, and it actually ended up working out rather well. So this is kind of an extreme version, but because it's consistent within the entire conception of the narrative, it actually worked really, really well, and it had a really great whimsical quality to it. So not to say that you'll have to resort to, and you'll be capable of resorting to this kind of a solution, but that's just one example of how simple you can make something and it'll still work within the context of whatever it is you're working on. And we'll go into this a little bit more as we move forward with the presentation. Next slide. So another important principle is to use things that already exist in the world as much as possible to help ground any type of fantasy that you might be trying to establish. So here I have a few images as an example of, I think it's a B-52 bomber from World War II. It's the American bomber plane. And then I have a saucer, and then you can combine those two, you get the next slide. You essentially get the Millennium Falcon. So this is like a Star Wars thing. So Star Wars is very well known for borrowing a lot of things design-wise from World War II, because a lot of the models were actually made from World War II based models of like the different ships, tanks, trucks, stuff like that. And you can actually see the cockpit there looks just like a cockpit from a B-52 bomber. You know, like that's a good example of something that looks otherworldly and fantastical, but still feels very grounded. And it's something that we don't quite know how, but it's grounded in reality to some degree. So this is kind of like a famous example of how, you know, to use things that already exist in the world for something that is highly fantastical, but also function in a way that we can recognize certain elements of it. So if you go to the next slide, you can actually realize that a lot of Star Wars is based on World War II, down to the Imperial uniforms that are based on Nazi regalia and that kind of thing. And you know, to take that farther, the X-Wing versus the TIE Fighter, just as a basic example of how shape language and form language and finishing was used to create these two very starkly different aesthetics for the Rebel Alliance and versus the Imperial army. Next slide. So another important, really important principles is that although you can make the larger world very fantastical, but also grounded in reality, like we talked about already, you can also do that on the smaller details, and you can really bring them into focus. So these details become really, really important. And that's something that a lot of people kind of tend to forget as they design their world. Things like graphics, posters, little props, things like that. They should all feel like they're consistent and cohesive with the world, not just a big expansive world that you're creating. And they actually create a great sense of immersion from, you know, especially if you're creating something like a movie. So I really love Wes Anderson's films because they do this very well. So one example is the Grand Budapest Hotel, which is where all these props are from. So you can see there's from money to keys to different documents, evidence, all has sort of like an official quality to them as it's been thought out and brought about in the real world, although it's a completely fictional world. Okay, next slide. Here's another example. By the way, Annie Atkins is the artist that does a lot of this kind of stuff. So you can look her up if you like. She's got some fantastic work that she does. And here's a sort of a big board from Isle of Dogs, another Wes Anderson movie. But again, everything here you can look at feels like it's grounded in the world that's been created specifically for this movie. And seeing things like that really creates a lot of legitimacy to you know, any shot, any background that you might have this in, right? So next slide. David, next slide. Oh, so here's another example of similar things. This is some stuff from by this artist Emerson Tung from Doom. I think it's Doom Eternal, the video game. But I just love looking at stuff like this because, again, it's grounded in something that already exists. It's grounded in occult symbolism and graphic things that already exist, but it's been sort of heightened and exaggerated and brought to a more sort of extended form. And that creates a lot of immersion for the environments wherever these things are used. And then another point that I'd like to make that we're going to elaborate more on later on is if you go to the next two slides, David. So these are some of the graphics from the human world of in Doom Eternal, which are very, very different and much more simple and feel like they belong to our world to some degree, except they're more specific to the world in the game. And that contrast kind of creates a really great sense of depth through the world and how these different elements within the world are different, but also correlate to some degree. Just like kind of like the TIE fighters and the X-Wings from earlier. One more. So here's another example of some of that. So very clean cut versus something that's very rough. And, you know, just the styling of the graphics is very, very different. Next slide. So another really important thing to remember when you're doing any kind of world building design is to have clear boundaries, but suggest a bigger world, meaning something like a map. It doesn't necessarily have to be a map, but it kind of creates an understanding for you within this world. And it creates an understanding for the audience within this world. So a lot of times, you know, you'll see this in all kinds of media. You know, most obvious, of course, is film, is where you'll see something in the distance, but you'll never actually get there. You'll never be there, right? But the fact that it's there kind of creates the expectation for the audience that that is a real place, right? And this is something that you can do with all kinds of things. Maps are the most obvious, and I think I have a few more examples. Next slide. This one's, of course, is more of a closer place. It's more of a castle / city. So yeah, and it kind of creates a sense of scale as well. Gives you a sense of this place being real, right? And it's also kind of like the way this is particularly is made. It feels like it belongs in a certain type of world. Next slide. And here's one that's more expansive towards a more of a global view of this world, or a different world now. But I just think it seems like maps are very, very important to helping plan and understand worlds, and actually a very, very useful tool to comprehend what is going on and to help plan things, right? So keep going. There's one, keep slide. So, you know, the same thing you can do with things like props and smaller things. So obviously this isn't in Star Wars, but the fact that this exists out there and the audience can kind of look at this and sort of anticipate this really exists within the construction of the X-Wing, which is of course not the case, because those are all just models and they're probably hollow. So they don't have all this engine parts and stuff like that. But having this construction in the mind of the audience or whoever is looking at this kind of creates the expectation that this is what's inside. So it's essentially, it allows the audience to use their imagination to fill in the gaps instead of just not really knowing what's there. So you want to try to provide as many of these little clues as possible, even if it's not necessarily this kind of blueprint, but little details on the ship itself. Continue, next slide. I think one last example of this is, you know, not necessarily this particular scene from The Thing, the new version of the movie, but you know, you might be familiar with scenes, dissection scenes in movies, meaning some alien creature dies or some monster dies, and the characters bring this creature on in some sort of a medical facility, and they start dissecting it to try to figure out, for example, what its weakness points are, or what it is, or what's going on. And having these kinds of scenes is essentially what this kind of principle is that I'm talking about. You're establishing the idea that there's more to the world than there is on the exterior, that there's an actual functionality to everything, and it's not just a bunch of random elements, right? And again, you can be very smart about how you do this. In the case of the dissection scene, you only do this with the one monster, and you don't dissect the whole thing. You only dissect the certain parts that are relevant to the narrative. In this case, if, for example, they wanted to know, well, how did it grow those spikes? You know, right? They might dissect the spike and that'll tell you, right? So that's just kind of like the idea of how you could potentially use these kinds of things and in a way that helps the narrative move forward. All right, so another really, really important element of world building that I think a lot of people tend to sort of like disregard or not really consider is cause and effect. So some classic examples are, you know, that are at fault, generally speaking, are, you know, time travel movies. So for example, basically what this principle means is if there's some sort of a technology magic economy or a natural system in play that is different from what the audience is used to, that needs to reflect on the world throughout, right? So, you know, one of the examples, another really good example that I have is Monsters, Inc., the Pixar movie. So this is a picture of the scare floor. And I think like this kind of ties in because Robert had mentioned Monsters, Inc. in his presentation. And so I think this kind of ties into that, because I think it's a really good example of how they took that concept and brought it into an environment in a way that makes you think, of course, that's how it works, but that's probably took some effort to figure out that that's the way they want to display it. So first of all, if you look at the design of this room, it looks very much like a very ordinary warehouse, right? Everything is kind of, bland except for the doorway apparatus, which is very bright. Of course, that's where your attention is supposed to go. But everything has sort of like a utilitarian feel to it, to give you a sense of this is a very serious kind of job type of environment. So if you go to the next slide. And then, of course, they do things like with lighting, and they set it up to put even more emphasis on that. So I just thought that was a cool shot of how you can change the lighting on something, and it kind of changes the environment in terms of drama. Next shot, next slide. So even things like the buttons and the numbers and the way that was designed feels very utilitarian. Feels very basic. Feels very like Microsoft versus Apple. If you want to use that example, but yeah, it's just like you can kind of see how that's brought into every part and piece of every aspect of that environment. Next slide. And then the other thing that I love about this whole environment is the map, which again kind of creates a lot more credibility and fantasy in terms of how this whole environment functions, how this whole concept of having monsters, jump out and scare kids throughout the world kind of works, right? You don't have to really explain how the teleportation works from door to a kid's room, but it's the way it's inferred makes it feel more believable, and all these details kind of add up to make that happen. So another example real quick is Zootopia, which I love because it's a really, really good example of world building, in this context when I'm trying to explain to people what it is. So at first, if you look at Zootopia, it looks pretty vast. It looks pretty elaborate and complex. And to someone who isn't familiar with design might look at it and think like, well, how the heck do you design something like this? It looks gigantic. It looks massive. There's so many things going on. So this is, again, if you go back, this is kind of how maps, if you go forward, David, you can kind of see how that was created, how that really helped figure out the complexity of the city. So you have a map like this or something to figure out where the different creatures that this whole elaborate construction would have to retain. So, there's essentially an environment for every kind of species of animal in terms of environment that needs to be there. So if you go to the next slide, David. And again, you look at inside of the city and you start to get little glimpses of that. Different buildings kind of have different vibes to them. There are different greener areas there are sandier areas. And then if you go forward, and then of course there's little tiny areas because of course some of the creatures are very small. So this is again a really, really great example of cause and effect. So if you have a city where there are a lot of animals all live together, of course some of them are going to be different sizes. So of course you're going to have a city where all the small creatures congregate, not just in the big giant city, right? So this is a really cool, fun way to really show that. And this is like one of my favorite parts of the movies where they go into this miniature town. Next slide. Little rodentia. And of course, this is where all the mice and other small rodents live. Next slide. So to them, this is what the town looks like, and a regular animal, of course, looks gigantic. Next slide, David. And of course, as well, to continue with the sort of idea of cause and effect, if you have a town where there are all animals, of course, you're going to have some Arctic animals that prefer the cold. So of course, you're going to have a cold portion of the city. And if you go to the next slide. And then of course, you have a hot desert part of the city. It doesn't really matter how that functions, where both of those things can exist. The important thing is that it establishes the world really, really well, where all of these different creatures are able to be accommodated. Next slide. All right, so I think this is the last principle, which is basically, it's very important. And the next thing that I'm going to talk about is understanding application and context of your world. And remember earlier when I mentioned you can't possibly design everything? Well, you really need to understand what it is that you're designing and for what purpose, because different types of context need different type of approach, right? So to start, you're basically, when you're creating any sort of entertainment, or at least modern entertainment, you're trying to fulfill these basic instincts that humans have, that we've developed over very, very long time since we've been animals, right? And those instincts are our exploration instinct, our hunting instinct, and our storytelling instinct. So exploration might go into something like, when you're playing a video game or you're going to a theme park, you want to go out and explore. Or even if you're visiting a new town, you want to explore. You just basically have this instinct to go and see it and to figure it out for yourself. The hunting instinct is basically, having to observe and to act and to basically change your environment through your actions. And that is very prevalent in video games and movies and everything. But video games, I would say especially, because it actually allows you to interact with the world directly. And of course, the storytelling instinct is when you go and you essentially create narrative around all of those things. All right, so now we're getting into the next stage of this lecture, which is just going over very quickly about what types of industry there are. I think this is really, really important because I think by today's standards, especially if you're a student, there's a lot of different type of artistic industries that require some sense of world building. And it's very confusing about how to apply those things to that. So it's really, really important, I think, if you're an artist, to understand what practice you want to be a part of. Because if you don't, it's going to be really difficult and challenging to figure out how to apply your skills to that particular thing, right? If you don't really even know what it is that you want to do. And that's very, very important because that, as they say, the medium is the message. So for example, if you're doing film versus animation industry or games, you're going to approach design very, very differently, just because there are different principles that motivate all of those different industry. So next slide, please. So one industry is experiential design. So that's essentially, any type of planning that is required for whether it's a theme park or a city or even a mall or a plaza or whatever it is that you're making. The goal is essentially to immerse your visitors or explorers or whatever you want to call the people that are enjoying your place, right? And you want to have them have a really good sense of discovery, exploration, just as we talked about before. And then another really important element of it is not to have it be overcrowded. So creating pathways, that are very smart about how that consider how to move people through this environment in a way that is economical and time-based, and encourages continued exploration without too many distractions or too many ways of getting away from the path, right? So next one. So next one is industrial design. And again, this is something that bleeds into a lot of design, when it comes to entertainment as well. But basically the priorities with industrial or product design is utility. It's figuring out how the thing works and making sure the thing looks good to a degree where people want to use it. In the case of if you want to design for something for a film, then object appeal might mean it has to fit a certain aesthetic that's already been established in the movie, right? Or whatever it is that you're working on. Next slide. And then there's advertising. And again, this is also very important to film and animation and games and all that kind of stuff, because you're trying to essentially connect with the target market. You're trying to understand their culture. You're trying to be as iconic with your message as possible. And you also might be trying to get into some kind of a subtext. And we're going to talk about subtext a little later in this presentation as well. And of course, gaming. So this is kind of what it's all been leading up to, because the huge reason why I wanted to have this section of the presentation is because I feel like a lot of people confuse, world building for games with world building for film and animation. And it gets really, really, really important to understand that difference. With gaming and creating video game worlds, the motivation behind creating those things is on gameplay, right? That's the number one thing that games try to achieve, is have the game be fun, essentially. And something that might be fun about a movie may not be so fun in the video game setting. So you're essentially creating an obstacle course and an interactive environment that the characters can move and interact with, right? And that is essentially the goal of gaming, right? It's not so much some of the other things. And of course, there's narrative and story and characters as well, but it just depends on what you're playing. But it's always, the core of gaming is always going to be on gameplay and creating that interactive environment or way of setting up the gameplay so it's fun, right? So then if we go to film, and you think about, well, in film, what is the priority then? Well, it's on performance, it's on actors. It's because people essentially come to, hear a story, and it's much more of a storytelling instinct. And we want to see we want to hear a narrative, and we want to see it happen in a certain timed fashion. So for example, in a game, you're not really timed. You can enjoy the world in however you want. Within film and animation, that is all sort of staged for you. So then if you go to the next slide, then what does animation offer that film doesn't? And to answer that, it's basically this, the way I see it, at least, is it offers a form of heightened reality. It offers exaggerated movement. It offers more range and style, and more exaggerations of expressions to kind of drive that storytelling home a little bit better. Sorry, I had to take my phones off. David, can you still hear me? Can you still hear me okay?
Yes, I do. Actually,
okay, cool.
If I do, then hopefully everybody else too.
All right. So then you might ask, what about things like illustration, comics, painting, instructional? And yes, this isn't like the most comprehensive list. I mainly just wanted to make a point on what should motivate your where do you find the motivation for the type of development that you're creating? And yeah, there are other things out there. And hopefully I try to come up with things that are relevant to this particular presentation. But yeah, the list kind of keeps going, and hopefully you can kind of use your own judgment on how it's relevant or not. All right, next slide. So this kind of leads into the third part of our presentation, which is about emotional response tools, and what tools are available to you for world building that will actually create an evocative response from the audience, which is essentially what all this leads up to, right? We want to be able to move an audience. We want to be able to provide them with sorry, things are falling over a little bit here. Okay, we want to be able to provide them with a way to connect through the environments and the design decisions that we're making. So if you go to the next slide, David. So this kind of, in a way, you can think about it, it's an easy way to explain it is through character costume design. We'll just then apply that to environments. So for example, with the costume or with the character, a lot of your goals are similar to what you would have with creating an environment. So for example, creating a time period that's specific to the narrative, using materials that are available within that environment, having signaling the occupation, rank, and status of the character, whatever cultural references in terms of like what music do they like, what kind of clothes do they wear, what kind of jewelry do they like, right? Kind of aesthetic are they going for? Shape design as well, in terms of, do you want this to feel aggressive? Do you want this to feel dynamic? Do you want this to feel warm and welcoming? Shape is very important for those things as well. So next slide. So with that said, basically, if you had to design an environment for a specific character, and I'm using the example of Sherlock Holmes versus Columbo. If you're designing a Sherlock Holmes office versus Columbo's office, obviously those would be very different, because if you're familiar with those characters, and I feel like most people are, which is why I use them, you're trying to basically establish what is their character within that environment. So some examples of this from next slide. So from one of my favorite movies, Trips at Belleville, is this sort of apartment that you start out in the story where it's like essentially a grandma lives there, and everything's kind of there set up for her height, and it has sort of like a warm, nice environment to it, and it definitely has a specific character that fits her. And then later on, you see her grandson kind of take over that environment, and it changes a little bit, and it's much cooler, but a lot of the same elements are still there, right? And it still has a lot of that character, but feels much more specific to him, in that it's less messy, it's much more orderly. So this is a really good example of how a different character functions within a similar environment. Next slide. And then, of course, from the movie as well, there's the three sisters, the namesake of the movie. And, I just thought this was really cool in the way they did this, how cramped it is, and the way it sort of responds to the narrative of the story, that they've sort of fallen from grace and they're kind of struggling, but they're still able to be together and supporting each other in this environment. And then kind of the way you see that in the design is through this sort of a cramped state of this room. So there's some examples, there's some more. Next slide, please. So this is from Big Hero 6, an environment from the house, which I think is owned by the aunt of this hero, of the character, the main character. And it's sort of set in the city of San Francisco. So it's supposed to be kind of like San Francisco and also have Japanese, Asian influences. So you can kind of see things like the tea kettle and things like that. But the main reason to show this is because it's very orderly compared to the next room, which is the next slide. And this is the kids' room, which is much more messy. It's much more character. It has like a toy collection in there. It has a little, it has a computer, it has several computers. It's got all kinds of a mess on the floor, like garbage and just fun stuff all over the place. And again, sort of reflecting the idea of knowing who your character is and then creating an environment that's specific to them. So now we're going to talk a little bit about how you can use your environments to sort of create a little bit of a sense of things that aren't really spoken in the dialogue or talked about, but fit thematically in terms of the general narrative that the film is taking. So, for example, you can use subtext to create opposing forces. So we kind of talked about that a little bit earlier about how in Star Wars, the Imperial Alliance and the the Imperial Army versus the Rebel Alliance kind of have this sort of a different aesthetic, and that's kind of what you want to try to push towards. Or also creating a literal shapes within the environment that create the subtext for what you're trying to convey to the audience, maybe in a way that isn't so direct. So for example, in Pan's Labyrinth, there are multiple elements within environments, and even in the faun, the creature himself, which are reminiscent of something, and you can't quite put your finger on it. But throughout the movie, it's repeatedly sort of stated visually, and that thing is the next slide. It's fallopian tubes. So it's a female reproductive organ, because there's a lot of themes of death and rebirth throughout the movie, and this is essentially how the director decided to convey that through this very sort of oblique message of having it basically be designed into the visuals of the movie. Next slide. And then, of course, if you look at Alien, hopefully everybody's seen Alien. That is also very much thematically there. And again, I'm picking these examples because they're most obvious. So hopefully everybody can kind of see how you can use visuals as a tool to show some of the thematic ideas in the movies, right? So the spaceship has some of those similar shapes that we just talked about. Next one. And so does this one. And of course, everybody's afraid of, there's a lot of fear, there's a lot of boundaries around sex and sexual organs and stuff like that. So, H.R. Geiger, the artist behind all this stuff, kind of used that to create a sense of sort of like body horror inherent within this sort of like alien creature. Next slide. And you can see that throughout the movie and like the design of the alien spaceship as well. Next slide. And again, you can sort of the same thing. Next slide. Here's another Guillermo Del Toro movie that I think is really cleverly designed. This particular set is Sally, the main character's room. And, you might wonder why it's designed a specific way. And, you know, I think everybody can kind of interpret it in their own way, but it certainly shows that it's a quarter of a circle. So it's an incomplete, incomplete window, right? It's an incomplete archway. It's an incomplete passage, an incomplete portal that she sort of can't pass through because it's not all the way there, right? And it sort of tries to show you that she's kind of like stuck in this life of sort of the daily grind in a way. But then there is a little bit of hope because in one of the next scenes, if you go to the next slide, her next door neighbor, who is also her very good friend, has the other side of the portal on his side of the apartment. So essentially together, they're going to kind of help each other to sort of step through the brutality and the grinding down of life by sort of completing each other on an emotional level. And of course, this isn't something that is expressly stated in the movie, but it's suggested through the design of the environment, right? So just another example of how you can use these sort of abstract ideas to visually convey a message to an audience indirectly. Next slide. And then another important tool is contrast. So again, going back to aliens, you know, if you see the alien ship and it's basically slick and dark and shiny, very limited lighting, and then you compare that to the human ship, next slide. Of course, it's all very antiseptic and white and very brightly lit for the most part. Next slide. Until you start to really kind of try to look at the rest of the ship, and you realize it's not actually all the same because they are trying to set something up with the movie, with the visuals of the movie. They're trying to set up a hierarchy. So for example, this is sort of like the dining room. This is where all the crew congregates. So it feels kind of like even keeled, but it feels welcoming. It doesn't feel as dangerous as the alien ship, which is when you see that stark contrast, it creates a sense of visual terror and makes you feel unsafe because you've already been set up to feel safe within this environment. Continue. And of course, the warmest room is the captain's quarters, where it feels the safest. So cool lighting within the alien ship gives you a sense of eeriness and danger. And of course, space is also very cool, cool tones. And this sort of warm environment, it kind of creates a sense of a womb-like feeling of the captain. Of course, that's where he sort of hangs out, right? And that's kind of where most of the ship is sort of like this until, next slide. See sort of like the infirmary where things get a little cooler, and that's because there's an underlying sort of malevolence to this character as well, who ends up having some underlying issues as well, which I don't want to spoil. I'm guessing most people have seen Alien, but just in case, I'm not gonna ruin it for you. Next slide. And then of course, lastly, I just wanted to show that the underbelly of the ship, where the workers are, actually starts to feel a lot like the alien ship. And that's because, of course, that's where a lot of the alien attacks start. It's also the workers that start, sort of being killed off very quickly. So there's almost like a hierarchy that's established within the ship itself. So I didn't want to just sort of show the contrast here, but I also wanted to point out how cleverly the design aesthetic of Alien is used, even though it's a pretty old movie by now, but it still has these very sophisticated lessons that we can learn from it. All right, next slide. Another example from a few examples from Triplets of Belleville to just kind of hit home this sort of like idea of contrast as a tool. So here is their home, the main character's home in their hometown in France. And then when they go to the town of Belleville, you can go to the next slide. A similar situation looks like this, right? So we're trying to establish, you know, how small and trivial things were back there compared to this environment here, right? Next slide. And again, sort of representing what it looks like there, and then you change the place and it looks like, next slide. So then it looks like more like this, where things aren't quite shot so tightly together. They're more expansive. Feels like there's more space. Things feel bigger. So that's what you're trying to establish. Next shot. Next slide. So again, from far away, things still feel very small versus in the big city. If you go to the next shot. Next slide. Not only is it much bigger far away, it's much bigger closer, and they're also using this extreme shot of perspective to sort of really establish how soaring and dynamic this environment is compared to what it was before. Next slide. All right, so now we're going to talk about another very important tool, which is tone and style. And to just sort of very blatantly establish what that is, it's like 60s Batman versus you know, Christopher Nolan's Batman, right? Very different, and it's tonally and stylistically. And if you look at the way the story is set up and the narrative set up, that's done very much intentionally and for a reason, because that tone really fits the narrative a lot better for each different case. And I have a few more examples to sort of drive this idea home. Next slide. So for example, oh, I don't know, it's looks like the image shifted. That's okay. So a show that I worked on, Troll Hunters, you know, this is what the troll market, essentially this idea of an underground city dwelling looks like. And then if you go to the next slide, this is what you know, Guillermo Del Toro's version of the same concept looks like in more of like a darker Hellboy universe, right? So it's the same idea. There's similar principles, but one feels much kind of like scarier, grittier than the other, right? Next slide. So this one has bright crystals, has a lot more color. The general shapes of the rocks are bigger and bulkier and more shapely, I would say. And then you see in the next one, so things are slightly grayer. There's more textures, there's more thin shapes, there's more intimidating shapes like those gears. In the last image, there were spikes even to make it feel scarier and less welcoming than the Troll Hunters troll market. So just an idea of how to use shapes to establish that. And then the last thing I would want to point out is that color is very important. Color in world building and establishing a sense of narrative is essentially kind of like the soundtrack, the visual soundtrack for the entire movie or any kind of event or experience that you're creating. And I just kind of wanted to use a few of my favorite color scripts from Pixar, which is Incredibles and Up, and just to kind of point out how they sort of use color to create that sense of creating an emotional response from an audience. And it's all done by setting it up along with the narrative. And you know, color script is the most obvious way to show how the visuals line up with the story that's being created, right? So for example, if you look closer at this, and of course I need another lecture to really go into all the details of creating a good color script. But basically what you have going on here is there's certain types of colors, no, go back, that represent the past, that represent action, that represent, you know, essentially wanting to move past where you are now, which is represented by gray and cool colors. And there's also this sort of like warmer kind of neutral color, which kind of represents when the family is together, right? And then those things are all echoed throughout the movie. If you look at the top portion, it almost kind of mirrors the bottom portion, right? So all those things are kind of like set up in the beginning and they're mirrored towards the end, right? That's done very much on purpose. So I would sort of like, you know, I'd love to watch this movie and see how exactly they've done that. And I would encourage you to do the same. And the next one is Up, which is kind of does this very similar thing where it sets things up in black and white, it sets things up in color, it establishes them from a very early point. And essentially when things are very colorful or they are very warm, that sort of represents hope. That represents the hope in the character's life, right? And then that's represented again with this burst of color of this new character being introduced to him, right? And you know, that's echoed throughout the movie in that way. So again, that's a tool that you can use to create a sense of emotion for the audience and sort of again create consistency throughout the whole thing. Next slide. So some key takeaways from what I just talked about is essentially what you want to do is you want to weave not only just like the principles that I talked about, but use all the tools that you have at your disposal to create an effective form of character design where you put the narrative and the story first, not just trying to create impressive visuals. So consistency is really, really important. You don't want to just think of some cool stuff that you want to throw in the movie or in whatever you're working on and try to make it all work together. It has to sort of like make sense together. Story comes first and then you design for that, right? And it really is about developing a strategy where you want to evoke a certain emotion in the audience. And that's really, really important. And that requires a very strict structure to do that. And lastly, good narrative design is just understanding the narrative and its context, as I've talked about before. So, okay, so next slide. So just wanted to show you guys real quick how we applied some of these principles in at ANOMALIA last year. So for one of our projects, we had a human colony concept. So essentially, it's humanity is stuck on this island on this one tiny planet. And then there's also another world underneath that island that humanity is stuck on. And that world is actually where most of life on the planet happens, not above on the surface. So just going to show you some sketches of how we came to the final conclusion of our design. Next slide. Started out by just making a bunch of sketches. You know, the team was trying to figure out exactly how to sort of like show this crashed ship and then how to mitigate that with the amount of land that would be available and how people would survive there for, I think it was around 500 years or something like that. So we had to sort of like have enough resources. So they're all, right away we came upon these like technical issues with what would be possible within the narrative constraints of the story. So, the problem that we had was creating an iconic looking environment that would be recognizable and easy to remember, but also having it be grounded enough that you could imagine people living there for 500 years and still having all the resources that they need to survive. So there would be a mine, there would be a fishery, there would be a harbor and dock, and of course the most advanced part of the city would still be in the center where the spaceship crashed, and the people are still using that technology. So there was also like a hierarchy of sorts, right? Next slide. So then we started to come up with more environments of maybe mining some of the mountainous, hilly regions of the island and creating new buildings. Next slide. And eventually it kind of got to the point where we had a pretty decent idea of what we wanted the overall environment to look like and have all the important elements that were within the story represented in the concept art. Next slide. And then essentially we wanted to make a really awesome splash page piece of concept art to show that that would get the idea of what the movie is about kind of in one image. And this is kind of what they came up with. And this is, so you kind of can see a lot of the work that went into in the development into this final design of the island. And we sort of, and we will see a color version of that kind of like more refined. And there it is. So overall pretty successful, because you can definitely tell that that is a spaceship and there's a city there on top of it. And of course, there's more things that we could do with it, but basically that's an example of kind of taking a lot of the principles that I talked about and trying to make them work within the narrative conception of the world. And that's it. That's it for the lecture. Hope it was helpful to some people.
Thanks, Rustam.
Yeah.
I guess if there's questions, then you guys could really openly chat with Rustam. Keep yourself visible.
Oh, sorry, I don't know what happened. There, give me a sec. All right. There you go.
Okay, one question here, and I'm quite curious if you're able to answer this. It's rather long. Aside the presentation we saw now of the scissors, I saw demonstration of designing and producing a car in one day with 3D printers, metal and recycled plastic ones. How far from now is the time when we can design and produce everything in our homes?
Well, I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. Is the short answer. I think probably pretty far because there's a lot of problems with 3D printing. It's not, we can print simple things. We can print some complex things. I think the problem is material. I think they still can't crack making 3D prints out of metal and stuff like that. So I think there's still some issues to get through with that.
Well, basically, you could already design things at home already now, right? Because that's what you're doing. You're stuck at home because of the COVID, and then you're designing from home.
Sure. Yeah.
There's one more question. When you start working on a project, is it with an idea in mind and then you work to develop it, or you look up stuff and see what catches your attention?
Well, first of all, I'm usually not the one that comes up with the idea of what happens in the story. That's already kind of there already. So there's a conception of what you were trying to achieve within the confines of the narrative, right? So then once you have an idea of what needs to happen there and what you're trying to say, then you try to correlate that with the design decisions that you're making. And they might inform some elements of the story even. For example, with something like, when I was talking about Zootopia, I'm sure as they were developing that, a lot of the design also inspired the script. As a matter of fact, I'm pretty sure that is how that happened. But there was a story to begin with. And as they sort of developed, it went kind of like back and forth. I'd say that's probably the best way to do it. But just having at least a really good idea of what the world's about and having some concept on paper is a really great start before you can move on to the visuals, because the visuals are all informed by the narrative, not the other way around.
And advice, so for someone who started to be interested in environment and architecture, has a background in interior, but don't know where to start to figure out what type of this broad field is for them. I know it's a very broad question, but so is the field. So how can we learn more about the positions and work?
I think that's kind of going back to what I was talking about with learning about different practices that are out there and figuring out which one fits you best. Basically it's what is it that you want to do with your work? Do you want to make a movie? Do you want to make games? Just understand, although they have similar principles and there are similar skills that are transferable from one to the other. So I'm sure some of your skills are transferable. For example, if you try to start working in games, it's just a matter of what is it that you want to do, and that's really up to you to figure that out. I would just start doing research and figuring out where you fit in with the skills that you already have. And then once you have an idea of what kind of work you'd like to do, it makes it a lot easier to learn the skills that you might be missing from that in order to move forward to whatever career path you would like to have.
Okay, how to get through the hesitance to cut the things that do not support the design anymore, but you're just emotionally attached to them? How do you get to that point?
So is the question, if I can clarify, how do you have clarity in terms of what to get rid of and what to keep? Is that kind of the question?
I think that the question means that if you fall in love with something that you've designed, but perhaps eventually, it doesn't really support the story maybe, but like, how do you get rid of things? How do you choose the priorities, I guess?
Right. So yeah, so that's narrative comes first. So no matter what you design, if it doesn't fit with the story for some reason or another, then to try to jam it in there somehow to try to make it work is not a good idea because it's essentially going to be sticking out and it's not serving your story. So what you could do is you could have it be kind of like, when we talked about having things be opening the world up by presenting things that don't necessarily function, but they're there and you can see them and you have some idea of what they're for, and they kind of create an expanse for the world. As we talked about, like in the earlier part of the presentation, you can still have those things. They'll just have to be kind of in the background, and they can still look beautiful, and they can still kind of serve a purpose in the background. And maybe they will serve a purpose of some sort in the future. If this project still has legs, or you want to make a sequel or something like that. But if it doesn't serve the story, then I would say it needs to stay in the background at the very least, and at most be completely cut out of the story. That's just how that works.
I have a question. Can you think of like moments, projects, or specific visuals that you designed that influenced the story so much that the director or writer or producer basically was like, oh, I didn't think about that, you know, like your position as a visual artist having an influence on a story.
Right. So that does happen. If line is going well, that shouldn't happen. So I would say, you know, it happens less commonly, I would say, in film and movies, just because to make everything costs so much money. So for you to just come up with an idea that's immediately being adapted into the script, that doesn't really fit with the pipeline. Usually the way it works, the script is done, then it's storyboarded, and then along the point that where it's being storyboarded is where the visual design comes in as well. Is storyboarding process and visual design kind of work together in a way. I mean, it does happen because people get stuck on scripts, and a lot of times the story doesn't get developed as quickly. So sometimes they'll go back to sort of like the artists and be like, hey, we need some ideas for what can happen from point A to point D or something like that, right? Or from point C to point D, right? And you might have a map, you know, which is something, you know, in my experience, I made like maps or worked out what the environment works as a whole, how it works, and then you'd have a director or writer or someone come across this sort of like a map type thing and be like, oh, if they're here, then they can make it over there, right? So that makes sense. Maybe we move some things around, but this now has value to the story. So I would say that's kind of what I mentioned. Maps are valuable because it's a really easy way to visualize the world, right?
It puts everybody on the team on the same page. Hey, can you elaborate on clarity?
Clarity. What does that mean?
Clarity.
Elaborate on
maybe
clarity.
How do you achieve clarity? Like, I suppose the point is that lots of times you're basically told like clarity is important, you know, make things clear. In story, especially, like clarity is like make it clear so people follow, you know, something like that. But like, whatever like comes up to your mind when somebody asks a question, you know, clarity.
Yeah, no, I get that. I think I get it. I mean, I'll try to answer that best I can. So I think when I think of clarity, I think of making things iconic enough that you look at them once. So you kind of get what's happening. So, you know, that's part of designing environments that work visually very quickly. So, you know, for example, when I was showing you the triplets of Belleville stuff, it's so obvious how small the town in France is compared to the town of Belleville. That's a very clear statement of contrast. So I think using contrast that way is a good way of making things clear in terms of abstract visual ideas throughout. That's just one example. I think another thing that I can think of is when there are visual gags happening within the story. So for example, you know, I had a movie where it was happening in a theme park, and there was a big gag with a roller coaster, right? And that part was being storyboarded, so all the gags had to be very clearly designed into the environment. So then we had to sort of like shift and change the environment design on the map in order for the gags and the storyboard to work. So there's a lot of there's a bit of teamwork involved with making sure that the necessities of the movement in this case match with what's there in the design, right? So that when it's timed and then approximately when you're having the animation happen, it all feels cohesive. It doesn't feel like a bunch of random cuts, right? So that's kind of how I would answer that.
How do you decide when the design for the environment is complete? How do you choose when design fits better, especially when there are a couple of designs that match the narrative need? You know, Like, I think the decision making, people are asking questions often about like how
yeah,
to
no,
wrap up.
so yeah, I would say it depends on your process. It depends on how you're making something. So for example, if I was, working on an animated film that was 2D animated versus 3D animated, that process would be very different because I would essentially refer back to the storyboards for the 2D process. If it was 3D, you could keep changing it, changing the environment up to the point where it's in the 3D space. So, my answer in terms of how it relates to design, I would say there's not really a final point until you actually planned it all out and you're making the movie, right? You can essentially move things around and design them up to that point. I think with something like visual development, the main thing that's important is to get the idea across so that it has the effect that you want it to have within the narrative. So there might be even shots that you're picking out within the storyboarding process that you make sure that are able to be perform as intended within the environments that you've created.
And any tips about choosing? Sorry, any tips about choosing the right colors?
The right colors.
Yeah.
Again, so I would just kind of go back to I was talking about the color script and a little bit of how I was talking about like the alien ship, right? It's kind of like you want to signal to whoever, whether it's your audience, whether it's someone that's experiencing your work or whatever. I'm just going to refer to audience because that's what I'm familiar with. So if you want your audience to respond in a certain way to what you're doing, you need to sort of plan out your color strategy. It's almost like it's like poetry in a way, almost. How do you want your audience to feel at any certain point? Do you want them to feel depressed, or a sense of sorrow, or just a sense of apathy? Or do you want them to feel exuberant, happy? And it doesn't necessarily reflect the color itself. It reflects how you structured your narrative. So for example, if you said that gray and blue happens when characters are happy, that's what the audience is going to follow now, right? And again, this is a bit of a stereotype, and it tends to work a lot better in animated films than it does with live action films, for example. But it tends to be the case where whatever you set up the certain symbolism of the movie, of what it means emotionally, the audience is going to follow that, right? So that's what I would focus on, is figuring out in your narrative what emotions are happening that you want to evoke in your audience first, and then figure out what colors and lighting situations coordinate with that. And then everything should kind of fall together.
Okay, here's a question, like, any recommendation for artists that are focused on designing environments for VR? How do you feel about using VR tools like NVR or Quill? Is it just cool to use, or people are actually using it as a standard part in their production? Have you heard of these apps?
Oh yeah, I love them. I use them. I have used Oculus Medium for some very quick, like, environmental sketching. So it was a big environment, and I essentially just wanted to plan it out. And I wasn't even intending to use the 3D. It was just kind of like for me to use. And I actually ended up using some of the things in there for painting. I don't think people are using them in terms of any kind of final or finished product, because they're just not refined enough yet, or simple enough to use yet, or people that are professionals aren't using those tools in particular. But I think that's going to change as the tools improve over time. I'm all for it. Like, I love that stuff. I think it's really, really great. And I think the future is very bright for VR type tools that are out there. I think we're just now starting to see them, how they're being used. But definitely there's a long way to go, because I think they can be improved a lot at this point.
I just mentioned that we've had Joe Daniels with ANMVR at our lab at Anomalia. He was teaching us how to use ANMVR, like developing environments and storyboards and animating. And as an animator, I found it really impressive that I could animate something that you don't have to rig very quickly, and then it feels like stop motion. So that was a really cool thing. And then we also had another lab where we were developing an animatic for a short film. So that was the first time when we tried to use NMVR for a collaborative single project. So it turns out to be slightly primitive in a way, but the idea like of doing everything in real time, it speeds up everything, and then also in space, that was really cool.
Yeah, I agree. I like that you can create a very basic environment, create a bunch of different shots of it that you can, like, for example, paint on top of, or you can use them for storyboards or whatever.
Any thoughts on Neon Genesis Evangelion? We don't get much talk about anime, but I can see an action figure in the background.
Oh, my thoughts on it?
It's like your thoughts. If you recognize this question, then your thoughts, anything.
I mean, I'm a big fan. That's why I have it. I love it. I think, like, I was like a depressed high school student. I was very shy, very antisocial, much like the main character in the show. And then it was kind of interesting that, like, to me, I was right away interested in that show because it felt like it was speaking to someone like me specifically, and it made that person like the hero of the show, essentially, even though the person's completely inept and incapable and very vulnerable. It seemed to mirror a lot of my problems, when I was growing up. And also just like overthinking things, having an existential crisis when you're like way too young to have one. So yeah, for me, it was a very pivotal show to my growing up. So yes, I'm a big fan. Also, the designs are amazing. I still think, like, to this day, it's one of the best designed shows, like robot shows out there, bar none.
So what's the difference between your experience at Anomalia as a lab, the combination between learning and doing? Is that something that you explained that to me yesterday? So that was an interesting thought.
Right. So, I mean, I think the thing is that I think is valuable about Anomalia is that it's not quite a student experience. So we're not necessarily teaching you technique per se, as you would learn at a typical school. We're much more focused on trying to replicate a pipeline, an actual animation pipeline, and that gives you sort of like an idea of real professional experience that I think most schools don't really do, at least in my experience. Most schools are focused on developing individual skills, not really like things like, working in a team, which of course are very, very important if you're going to be making any kind of large projects. And also just like working within a pipeline, finding your place, presenting your ideas, things like that I feel like a lot of students struggle with are required for Anomalia, right? That's something you have to do. And it kind of like puts you on your heels a bit. It kind of kicks your ass in a way that I think a lot of people who are students in particular really, really need if they're going to have any chance of working on a real project, right? That's what I would say.
Last question, what was the inspiration behind choosing your career?
Inspiration. Well, that's kind of a complicated question. I think partially it's timing, because when I was coming up with in art school, I wanted to be an illustrator, and the illustration industry was falling apart, but the special effects and animation industry was coming up, and it was doing really well. So I didn't have any money. I was poor, and essentially I didn't want to owe money for the rest of my life. And I was like, I'm gonna go with the one where there's actually a chance of me paying off my loans and stuff. And that's the one I went with, and it was animation. I kind of meandered a bit. I spent some time in advertising, theme parks, stuff like that, but ultimately I landed in animation, and that's what I enjoy the most too. But I also just thought it was really cool. It was a very exciting time to be working in that industry. As it was like kind of coming up, I still think like we're still at just the beginning of what's possible. I think there's more very interesting things ahead.
Any final thoughts before we wrap up?
My final thoughts?
Your final thoughts after listening to you all 1 hour and a half.
Oh, do you want to do the final thoughts based on what I've said, or do you want me to do it?
Okay, you go ahead. I'm just.
I hope this was helpful. I kind of treated it as a sort of a very basic, give you guys basic idea of what world building is, because a lot of people use the term, but not really understanding what it means really. So I try to kind of ground it a little bit and define some of the different principles and ideas behind what you need to do in order to think of how to create a universe that functions within a story, right? And that should be a fairly good start for anybody that is trying to do that.
Awesome, thanks, Rustam. And also like to thank Creative Europe Media for financially supporting this time to have you here, and CEEA Animation for organizing this, ANOMALIA, which is me, and Association of Czech Animation, because all this together, we put it together. And thank you for everybody being here. And we're gonna have another webinar with Shelley Hoffman. That's gonna be a TV show, storytelling, and that's what I'd like to end up with. One final presentation. Thank you.